He's a storyteller whose work captures the unsung heroes, the stories untold, and asks the questions many don't know the answers to. For my guest this week, his work isn't just about the stories overlooked, but the voices, the people, and the history that everyone needs to know. My friend Clennon King, coming up next on the PowerPLAY Show.
From the studios at Hull Bay Productions, this is the PowerPLAY.
Welcome to the PowerPLAY Show. I'm Tonya McGrath. Clennon King has spent much of his life as a journalist, documentarian, and social justice champion. His work transcends print, radio, and television. As an award-winning content creator, he has delivered stories most of us have never heard, like the passage at St. Augustine and the story of a 1960 lynching. In addition, he's tackled some of our most important issues, like COVID's impact, voter suppression, and the Black Lives Matter movement. At heart, he is a true champion of truth and justice in all its forms, and I'm proud to have spent just a tiny bit of my career with him. Clennon King, welcome to the PowerPLAY Show.
Thank you so much, Tonya, for inviting me. I'm flattered to be here, so thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You are so welcome. Look, I'm excited to be able to sit down with you because very seldom do I get to talk to people in my own field. So this is going to be a great conversation. But first, tell us more about you and how you became this amazing storyteller.
Well, I mean, number one, I always viewed not that story discriminates regionally, but I'm from the South, and some of the greatest storytellers that I think about are from the South. But, I was also from a family where, we were socially very active, politically very active. And so that kind of informed a lot of what ultimately became my journey. My father was the only Black lawyer in Albany, Georgia. And Albany, Georgia is significant from this standpoint, especially given that you're coming out of Massachusetts. And that is that Dr. King's first major campaign after Montgomery is in Albany, Georgia. That is, he leaves Boston, South End, and he and Coretta go to Montgomery, where they enter the world stage in 1955-56. And the very next campaign is in 1961, and it's in my hometown of Albany, Georgia, which is, of course, where my father's practicing law. And he's the only Black lawyer here, so he ends up representing him and scores of civil rights demonstrators, which made him a moving target. And he didn't want the sins of the father to be visited on his children, so he shipped us to New England boarding schools. And ultimately, I ended up, like my 4 older siblings, all in New England boarding schools. The first 2 in Massachusetts, 2 of them not far from you at Cushing Academy in Ashburnham, Mass. And the last 3 were in Putney, Vermont, and I was the last of the 5. And so that's how I got, to the region, to the Boston region. And then ultimately I went to college down in New Orleans at Tulane. And then from there, I took a year off between my junior and senior year, thinking that I wanted to write. And I wasn't from a family of artists. I was from a family of business people and people who were in the law. Mm-hmm. And so this was kind of dicey. So I took a year off and got a job writing for a newspaper. Went back to Tulane, finished up, went to law school at the University of London in England, and dropped out after a year because I knew very quickly that I was not going to be a lawyer. And at that point, ultimately, I ended up starting a career in television journalism. And so that's how I began my journey. And that led to the NBC affiliate in Dallas, ABC Atlanta, Fox Miami, NBC, ABC Jacksonville, NBC Mobile, and of course, WGBH for a month, the flagship PBS station in Cambridge, which is where I met.
Where we met, yeah. Right. I was going to say it was a very short time, but a huge impact, I have to say, because when I first met you, I just knew that what you had to tell was something I think maybe GBH wasn't ready for. And it was in your style, and I just was very, very quickly drawn to your craft. And I was a huge fan, and you know that. Talk about who some of your early influences were as you started to develop your craft as a storyteller.
Well, before I get to that, I just want to say that, when I reflect back, Tonya, on my time at GBH, I remember two people, both of them Black women, who showed me kindness and generosity. One I was much more in contact than the other. One was Callie Crossley, who became a real cheerleader, and as somebody who played a significant role in telling the story Eyes on the Prize, at least a chapter called No Easy Walk, which was about, again, Dr. King's campaign in Albany, Georgia. She was the producer, line producer on that for Henry Hampton. And so when I started thinking about doing a documentary, she was very, very important in terms of guiding me, in terms of giving me counsel early on. I had basically shot the film. I was in post-production. But, there's nothing like when you have somebody who believes in you, or at least believes in your vision. And she was that. And she showed me kindness. And the other person who showed me kindness, frankly, was you. You didn't know me from Adam, and you were so kind. I was only there for 4 weeks, but it was remarkable. And I remembered, you either got me coffee or something. It was just, you didn't have to do that. And so I just want to say to you on air while we're on air, I really appreciate that. And it makes it so. But in terms of people who kind of influenced me regarding filmmaking, at the time, before I really started doing TV news, there was a stint at which I worked for a client of my father. You'll remember I said he represented Dr. King, and one of his top field lieutenants, which you would know, or who you would know as Andrew Young, was mayor of Atlanta. And he basically asked me to come to work for him as a special assistant to him. And so I was with him for maybe 3 years. And it was during that time that Spike Lee came out with She's Gotta Have It. And I said to myself, that's what I want to do. And ultimately, Andrew Young, helped get me into a very competitive program in NYU's Grad School of Film. It's a 3-year program. I dropped out after the first year because I was married. I had a child on the way. I couldn't do New York graduate school and all of that. I just couldn't. And so I left and came back to Georgia and worked for 2 years for the very first Black mayor of Atlanta, who was Maynard Jackson. And again, he went and hired me as the film bureau chief for the city of Atlanta. And he also hired me at the same time as the manager of the government access station, cable station. And so I did that for 2 years before, again, as I said, got on the road and really began doing television journalism in earnest. That is visual storytelling, because that was the substitute in the end. That's the deal that I made with my then wife. And so she supported me on that. So I really appreciate that. But so Spike Lee was an extremely important, influence in that way. I can't say that I'm a huge student of film above and beyond. I just know a good story when I hear it, and it's not based on film school. It's based on TV newsrooms. Yeah. The currency is the same at the end of the day. A good story is a good story, period. And there's an arc. And you learn that very quickly in the business. And that became basically my graduate school in terms of how to do that, in terms of how to turn stories, 2 and 3 a day, and keep, a compelling narrative, and yet at the same time, keep the truth, up front and center. And so I would say, a lot of my influences are reporters who I worked with. And more importantly, because I work even more directly with them, and that is photographers.
Yes.
Because they, you're sitting in a car with them and they're telling you, okay, so we got this story to tell. and they're giving you feedback in terms of how to visually translate that story. And so they became, I became, praise of theirs as well. They became my mentors as well. And, these guys have been at it, well, many of them, for decades. And so that's where I learned my craft, I would say.
Yeah, let me shout out two major photographers who helped influence my work, and that's Howard Powell from WGBH. I don't know if you had a chance to work with him when you were there. Lance Douglas, incredible. Mike Mulvey, yes. And to your point, it's like we have the stories up here, but they're actually the ones that put it to light. And so, yes, absolutely shout out to them. I want to talk a little bit about some of your stories, ones that I'm very, very much interested in. And the first is Passage to St. Augustine, the 1964 Black Lives Matter movement that transformed America. Now, this is something that I think most people don't know.
Well, at the time, it came to my attention that this campaign called the St. Augustine Civil Rights Movement was a sleeper campaign. Everybody knows about Selma. Everybody knows about Birmingham. They know about Montgomery. To a lesser extent, they know about Albany. But very few people know about, St. Augustine because it's a Florida battlefield. And so not a lot of people knew. But if you think about it, there are two legislative victories to the Civil Rights Movement. There's the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. And the Voting Rights Act, of course, is associated with Bloody Sunday and Selma. And, DuVernay did a great job in terms of conveying that story.
Oh, yes.
And so, but in terms of the Civil Rights Act, which came in 64 as opposed to 65 with the Voting Rights Act, most people associate it erroneously with Birmingham. And while it is true, the dogs and water hoses, the 4 little girls dying, basically produced JFK's civil rights bill. Mm-hmm. What made it law of the land is violence in St. Augustine. And so New Englanders played a very central role in all of that. And I speak specifically to the mother of the sitting governor of Massachusetts, Chubb Peabody, Endicott Peabody, who was governor at that time. His mother came down, Mary Peabody. These are blue bloods. This woman grew up in Back Bay. She was a blue blood, and she went down with a Black woman out of Roxbury by the name of Esther Burgess. Mm-hmm. She was married to the first Black Episcopal bishop. And they went down together to desegregate, or try and, dine at cafes down there. And the place just, it was crazy. I mean, the reaction was crazy. And when she went to jail, when Peabody went to jail, that campaign went national. And part of the problem for, JFK is, and you got to look at the timeline, if you'll indulge me for a second, you've got a situation where JFK introduces a bill in Birmingham while Birmingham is going on. The dogs and water hoses happen. And then in August, everybody heads to Washington, D.C., where they have the March on Washington. And King delivers his speech. He goes back to Birmingham. And 2 weeks later, the 4 little girls are killed. And all of a sudden, that battlefield where he could dramatize basically segregation was dead in the water, because it became a federal city. It was not an example where he could point to anymore because the feds were all over that town. And so he needed a campaign that basically would, pass the bill into law. And so November comes around, that's in August. November comes around, JFK is assassinated. And when he's assassinated, all of a sudden everything falls to Johnson, and people were worried. Here's this Southerner, this Texan. Right. And basically he sits there and helps shepherd basically this thing into what became the longest filibuster in the history of the country. And it was through the dramatization of King going to St. Augustine and fighting that very bloody battle there, because it's considered the bloodiest campaign of the entire civil rights movement. It's ultimately what dramatized getting this bill passed into law. And who played no small role out of Roxbury was Mimi Jones, who we did a segment on when I was at PBS at WGDH. So that's that story. It was close to me only because at the time, initially, I was reporting for the NBC and ABC affiliate in Jacksonville, which is about 40 miles away from St. Augustine. And so, so you fall in love with certain stories as a journalist, as you well know. And this was one of the stories that I fell in love with.
More recently, you produced a Black Lives Matter story surrounding the death of Kendrick Johnson. And Kendrick Johnson was the high schooler who was in the gymnasium, and there was so much mystery about what happened to him. So how did you become involved in this story?
It was, I came by it honestly, in as much as my brother was his family's lawyer. And I was in Boston at the time. And he called me and told me the story, and I blew him off because I didn't take him seriously at all. And all of a sudden, I then began seeing the news reports, and he was saying, look, I need help. I need you to come down here and really begin to sort of mine and help me investigate what the heck is going on. And, the FBI is involved here and blah, blah, blah. And so I team up with my cousin, who also is a network affiliate photographer, who's I worked with him in Jacksonville, and I worked with him in Miami at SVN. And we rendezvous at Boston, down in Georgia. And we work for about 3 months, doing interviews and what have you. But this is basically the story about a kid, who goes off to school. He gets into a tangle apparently months earlier with a football player, who was on his team, and the guy happened to be the son of an FBI agent. And so we ended up, the thing was in part of our challenge as storytellers was to put a face on this FBI agent, because there was nothing out there in terms of what he looked like. And yet this story was all the rage. And so I had to sort of choreograph and plot how I would track this FBI agent down to put a face on him. And it came to my attention that there was a football game that was coming up. I mean, the boy was dead. They found the boy rolled up in a gym mat. Yep. But about a year later, the following season, the football season, there was a football game that was going on up near me. And it occurred to me, well, it stands to reason this kid is still playing football, which means that the parents are probably going to be there, which means that this father is probably going to be sitting out in the grandstands. And so what I did was basically position a photographer, my cousin in this case, position him on the field. And I then had to figure out where this man was. Wow. And I looked and looked and looked, and finally I found a man, and it had the kid's name on the back of his T-shirt. And so we were able to get him. And that video is still used by a lot of network news people to help tell the story. I mean, he ultimately had to resign. Nothing has been done. That boy's killers have still not been brought to justice. So again, it's a complex story, and it's still very much unfolding. And so, that's how I came to that story. And so I worked with the family for a long time, vis-a-vis my brother. So, yeah.
Wow. We need to take a quick break. More with journalist and documentarian Clennon King. You're listening to the PowerPLAY Show.
Hi, everyone. My name is Patricia Rossi, one of the 5 women who is featured in the upcoming documentary, More Than Our Skin. This documentary is about living with vitiligo. Yes, I know, I'm here, but I'm excited to share with you some exciting news about our kickoff rally event, which is starting as you listen to this until November the 30th. So, to let you know, we have 4, when I say 4, great giveaways to offer with all when I say all the proceeds going to the production of the film. You want more information, right? Well, for more information, please go to morethanourskin.org/raffle. And then you can find out about the exciting prizes that are being offered for the raffle. Great prizes, all for a great cause. You don't want to miss it. So, just in case you did miss it, it's morethanourskin.org/raffle. Hope to see the winning person. Thank you. We can use your help. morethanourskin.org.
Welcome back to the PowerPLAY Show with my guest journalist, Clennon King. I want to switch gears a bit and talk about the landscape of Black media. And do you see a vital role for Black media today and still?
I think that it's very telling, Tonya. I was just reading, I think last week, it was 2 weeks ago, maybe a month ago, I should say. I read that the Atlanta, I'm now down in Albany, Georgia, which is my hometown. I've left Boston at this point, and I've been away for about 2 years. But the big paper, of course, here in the state is the Atlanta Journal and Constitution. And I recently read that they have started a segment that is dedicated to Black news in that marketplace, which I thought was very telling. And you can imagine the impact it has on publications, Black publications like a Bay State Banner or the equivalent of that in Atlanta, the Atlanta World, what have you. But there's obviously a marketplace for that. And so that newspaper, that daily, has gone ahead and penetrated that. But not only that, last week I read that the Boston Globe has done the same thing. Mm-hmm. They're doing the same thing, which is very telling. To me, and I get this a lot, I've presented my films at a number of universities, and, the stock answer I keep getting from a lot of Blacks who are in the audience is, they didn't tell us about this. They didn't tell us about this. We should have been told about this. Yep. And my sensibility, no, that's not their job. That's our job. Mm. Mm. It's us who was at the feet of our grandparents who heard those stories. It's us who was at the feet. And so I think there's an affirmative responsibility that we have to go ahead and tell those stories. The other thing is that in terms of the equipment itself, there's no excuse. Mm. In my hand, most of my films these days, I shoot with a cell phone. And if the story is good, nobody ever asks, well, did you shoot it on Canon? Did you shoot it on Nikon? Did you shoot it on Sony? All they care about is the story. And so my sensibility is there's an affirmative responsibility that we as Black people have to go ahead and chronicle the stories of our families. I mean, this story that you learned about regarding my aunt, Marion King, was a story I'd heard since I was whatever. And her children, all of whom went to Ivy League schools, one to Dartmouth, another to Yale, another to Harvard. They never told it. Mm. So I decided to tell it. And so my sensibility is, I think sometimes it's just that simple, that you ultimately have to go ahead and just share stories. Otherwise, they're lost. They say when people die, it's not a book that disappears. It's an entire library that goes up in flames.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that's. I think that there's a self-responsibility. Much of our pain in this life, I believe, is self-chosen. And so we've got to do what we've got to do to begin to reverse that. And, and I'm talking as much to myself, Tonya, as I am to your audience. And that is, we can do this. There's no reason we can't do this. Even if you have a record, just to create the record of this stuff, I just think it's important. You got a video camera, you got a still camera, you've got record. And to me, that's everything. I mean, I wish I'd sat down with my father and recorded him.
Well, I'm so glad you said that, because one of the things I did with my grandmother, and I think this was back in maybe 2010, is I interviewed her. And my grandmother was born in the 30s. And so for her, it was just really kind of understanding this woman who had 3 beautiful children, one of them my mom, who then had a bunch of girls. My son is actually the first male in the family, but just to kind of talk about her experience with that and what it meant. And I was just watching it last week. And, she's passed, she's been gone since 2014. And I'm like, I will never, ever forget this, And I did the same with my mom. I actually interviewed her here on the PowerPLAY Show, just to do that. And you're right. We do have all this technology. We all have our phones that we can go and we can do this. So I think it's very important to do so, particularly when you have older people in your family. Get them on tape. The other tape, right? That just shows my age. Get them filmed.
Well, hold on, wait. Before you go on, though, Tonya, before you go on, I got to tell you, I don't know how this woman came to me, but she was a big muckety muck in Roxbury. I mean, her family was very prominent. And I know that the mother ended up being like the secretary, administrative assistant to Ed Brooke when he was senator, U.S. senator. And so anyhow, she dies. And the daughter, who went to Harvard Law School and became a real big luminary in the Black community and in Boston, she hired me to tell her mother's story. And her mother's story, because her mother's father also was white and was not really in the picture. And she basically gave me the interview. She granted me 3 interviews. Her husband did, her daughter did, and she did. And she gave me her archive. And she wanted a memorial to her mother. And I would love to share it with you, because it sounds very much like the experience of what you're telling me that your grandmother shared with you. But the stories are there. Yeah. They're there.
Yeah.
They're there. Anyhow, sorry.
No, that's fine. I want to go to imaging, which has always been a point of conversation when you talk about African Americans in media. And it's clear that, for me, the image that is being portrayed right now in stories is changing. But I feel we still have a lot of work to do. What are your thoughts on how we portray people? And this is not necessarily in documentary work, but just in media in general.
I gotta tell you, I don't know how to say this. I'm going to be a little bit irreverent, so please, excuse me. But, I don't consume a lot of narrative film. And so, I consume a lot of news. It's just what I do. And generally, half the time, I'm not even watching it in terms of video. I'm actually reading it and then deciding based on that. So I don't know that I can really sort of see. Well, I mean, I guess my question to you is what do you mean when you say the way they're portrayed? I mean, kind of unpack that for me.
Yeah, sure. So, let's just talk simply with commercials, because I'm seeing more and more African-American, particularly women, being portrayed with their natural hair. That's a huge thing, right? Okay. And those kind of images. I'm seeing there's this wonderful commercial, and I can't remember what the content was, but it shows this African-American father, and you see him in these very different scenes, right? And he's in a store and he's getting followed, or he's walking down the street at night and he's got a hoodie on, and because for whatever reason, they're portraying him in all these different things. And so the viewer's just like, oh yeah, here we go again. And then it cuts to him walking into a courthouse. And then you're like, oh, okay, so he's a defendant. And then he walks up to be the judge.
Oh, wow. Okay,
You know?
yeah, I did see that.
And
yeah.
so it really challenges you in terms of how you think about Black people and how they're portrayed in media. And I don't think that this is something that a lot of people, and I'm going to link to it on my website so people can see the commercial, because I just think it's just that powerful. But for me, it was just like, wow. And as a Black person watching it, I went through the, okay, oh, great, here we go again type of thing. And then they cut to him going into the courtroom and then going and putting his robe on and sitting behind that bench. And I was just like, well, damn. But it was, you know, and it's important because, you know, for I have a 14-year-old, and for these young kids who are consumed with everything with their phone, how do we then continue these kind of positive imaging in the work that we do? And that, I guess that was more along the lines of my questioning.
Okay. Yeah, I just recently spoke to a chapter of Jack and Jill night before last here in Albany. And, you know, I gotta say, you know, for me, and again, I come with prejudice, I really think that a lot of, you know, the answer to that question you just raised about how, you know, what do we need to do to make sure this next generation, you know, has, you know, strong images and what have you. You know, my message to them basically was this, that, you know, I think that the strongest lessons are in history. So they're in this, you know, one-horse town in Albany, Georgia, this dusty town. And I tell them, you know, when you think of somebody Black running for governor, you think of Stacey Abrams. And she's in Atlanta, which is 200 miles away from here. But what you don't realize is that Stacey Abrams' sister, who lives in this town of Albany, Georgia, every day, 5 days a week, reports for duty to work in a building named after the first Black to run for governor of Georgia. Mm-hmm. That person is my father. Mm. It's right downtown. It's 3 miles from where we're sitting. And so trying to use history basically to say, you know, look, you know, you got ruby slippers on too. You can click your heels, you can put in the work, and you can get it done as well. The other message to them I had is, you know, I think that, you know, many, especially for a group like that, because these are Black middle-class kids. And I just told them what my father told us when he first shipped us off on his dime to New England boarding schools. He said, basically, I don't care whether or not you end up at Harvard or Yale or Oxford, it doesn't matter. Basically, there's an affirmative responsibility you have to do for your community, to reach back and do for your community. I don't care where you end up. Wall Street, it doesn't. You have an affirmative responsibility, and that was always his message. You know, there was a white man who fell in love with a Black woman, who many of you know as Thomas Jefferson, and her name was Sally Heming. And the one quote that Jefferson is known for that I really like is that he says the tree of liberty must be watered by each generation, not just by my granddaddy's generation or my father's generation, but each generation. And, you know, something that Abina kind of mentioned, you know, in your podcast, and that was, you know, everybody's arriving and doing BMWs and all of that sort of stuff, but there's an affirmative responsibility that we have to reach back. And so in large part, that's my message to these kids, to look at history and to recognize at the end of the day, you too have to carry on for your children and great-grandchildren's great-grandchildren who you will never meet. You have that responsibility. And a lot of those lessons, a lot of those stories of inspiration are right in history. They're right there. So that's what, you know, and you know, and I gotta tell you, Tonya, I mean, and it's not just the kids, it's also the parents. I mean, I really look up to Greater Boston. See, Greater Boston is a very special place in as much as it's the home of the American Academy. I mean, this isn't just, this is the home of the American Academy. And so I hold them to a higher standard. And so when a alma mater like a Boston University can get out there and say basically that Dr. King and Coretta met on their campus, when in fact they met on the New England Conservatory's campus, then there's a problem.
Yeah.
Because my sensibility is, number one, there are all these PhDs, these historians, you know, this is the academy, this is a premier communications department at BU, and they can say that, and the Black community doesn't say anything. Why? Because they don't know the story? No.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think that we really need to look at our own situation. I mean, it's very fortunate in as much I was able to publish, or I got published, I should say, a fairly extensive, news article. Story about magazine story about the love story of Dr. King and Coretta, and and just find amazing, people who were still alive. I mean, I found an old girlfriend of his who was down in the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and this is before he even met Coretta, and this woman knew both, but it was right there in Boston. Yeah. She was able to share a picture of him and Coretta in the public garden across the street from the Common, a stone's throw from where, what's the guy's name? The Good Will Hunting, the stars of Good Will, Matt Damon and
Ben Affleck.
I'm sorry, Ben Affleck, and what's the other guy, Robin Williams.
Yes.
There's a bit where they were. I mean, it's the stories are all around us, and so that's Anyhow, I just think that to answer your question, a lot of what we can do in terms of sort of inspiring our kids, I think a lot of it just has to do with our own history. We don't have to look that far. We just don't. Even Aunt Marion's story resonated with you. I mean, who knew?
Yeah.
Why would it? I mean, you're a New Englander. Why? But I'm sure you got stories as well. I mean, that are just stories in your family. And there's power to that, and I think we have a responsibility to tell those stories. So.
Absolutely. We need to take another quick break. More with social and civil rights advocate and storyteller Clennon King. You're listening to the PowerPLAY Show.
Always a hard part of my day, because I knew that people would be staring at me on the subway, and that was the most difficult part of my day, because I had to learn to deal with ignorance. The people with the sunglasses, you got sunglasses on. Why do you have to pull your sunglasses down to look at me when you can see through your sunglasses? The closer I got to the subway, the little more of the anxiety would start. The palpitations in your heart. And then, you take a deep breath and you relax, because life goes on when you have vitiligo. And I was determined not to let vitiligo have me. That was a trial, but the trial still goes on because people still stare. But I know they're staring at me because, as my son says, I'm just beautiful. So they can't help themselves. Vitiligo 101, it didn't win over me. So I'm here, still standing, as they say. Still standing. So, yeah. The subway.
Welcome back to the PowerPLAY Show. My guest, Clennon King. Clennon, why are these stories so important to you and so important to be told?
You know, Tonya, it occurred to me, before the break, we were talking about, the power of inspiration for kids. And, when I first got to Greater Boston for about 1.5 to 2 years, I worked for a nonprofit over in Somerville, which of course is neighboring to your hometown of Cambridge. And I ended up, I guess the nonprofit was 2 blocks away from this apartment building. And the significance of this apartment building was the fact that this is where Barack Obama lived during his 3 years at Harvard. And I was able to rent an apartment there after taking these kids on a field trip to meet with the landlord. And these kids were like, their eyes were like the size of silver dollars. They couldn't believe it. And he actually let the kids into the apartment with the tenants there of where he actually lived, where Michelle Obama would have come and visited him while she was in Chicago, because of course she graduated before him. So anyhow, I think of stories like that. For them, that was a big deal. And the Boston Globe wrote it up and all these newspapers and what have you. So anyhow, I forgot. What was your question? I'm sorry.
Just the importance of why these stories, that we have to tell these stories, that we have this responsibility to keep these stories going.
I just think that, I can't remember the name of the writer. It was a woman writer, but she said something to the effect, I read it because I studied poetry when I was in college down in Louisiana. And it was something to the effect, we tell ourselves stories in order to live. Mm. And I think that that's true. Whether it's the Bible, whether it's just people talking, it's what keeps us. It keeps hope alive. It keeps love alive. There are takeaways. And then, at the same time, in some respects, I was talking to, and this is segueing into something that perhaps we have talked about at some point. But, we oftentimes think about monuments being built to mark history. But, stories as well become monuments in and of themselves. And so if I drop dead tonight, I know that the story of the fight at St. Augustine will survive because I sat down and chronicled and told that story and interviewed those people who fought that battle, both on the wrong side of history and on the right side of history. Mm. And so, and I think that all of us have the opportunity to go ahead and do that and create, if you will, a monument, because that's what storytelling is to me in the end. It's what survives. Stories survive. In a way, yes, monuments survive in the built environment, but stories also, capture a culture. They capture a people. And so for me, it's currency, it's oxygen, I don't know.
It really is. It really is. Is there a story that you haven't told that you want to in your young years, and you have so many years ahead of you to tell these stories?
There are 2 stories that I'm working on that are works in progress. It's weird. When I talked about the passage at St. Augustine film, that took me 13 years to get done. And there was a very dear friend of mine, very close friend of mine in Boston, who was an artist. And, she just let me know that she believed in me and she believed in my vision to get this film done. And within a month, I got it done because she said so. And so there's great power in people believing in other people. Let me just say that to you. The next film, Fair Game, Surviving a 1960 Georgia Lynching, only took me 13 months. Mm-hmm. So sometimes projects take a long time, and sometimes they're slower. I've got to make a living down here, so I've got to balance all of that. And so I have sort of a day job as well. I mean, I have to do consulting and what have you in terms of communications to keep the roof over my head, clothes on my back, food on the table. But the two stories that I'm working on right now are, number one, the Camilla Massacre.
Yes.
I'm working on that story now. I'm in pre-production on it. I'm scheduled to go to Indiana to meet with the man who was a preeminent scholar on that 1868 campaign. And yeah, I know people, of course, who are associated with my aunt, but they're here and they're alive. I'm not worried about them. I am worried about this guy who is a scholar and who knows that narrative. So I need to get him on film now. And so within the next month or two, I'll be going up to Indiana to meet with Lee Formwald, who is just a monster of a scholar, historian. And so his alien health, and I need to go see him. So that's one. The other is that I'm working on, and I've been working on it for a while, is a story on pre-abolition slavery in New England, and namely in Boston. Generally we think of Boston as being sort of the epicenter, the ground zero, if you will, for the abolition movement. And while that may be true, the reality is when you think about the first place, the first colony to legalize slavery, it wasn't Virginia or Georgia. It was Massachusetts. It was, and so they were selling enslaved Africans on Boston Common. Benjamin Franklin was supporting his newspaper in Boston based on runaway and slavery sale ads. And so again, this is journalism. This is my, working and mining the story. And so in large part, I wanted to sort of expand that narrative to look at, at a different angle, and be more authentic in terms of really what Boston and generally New England's association is with slavery. And so, and that's the other thing I'm looking at. But I'm looking at it, they always say, and I know I'm not telling you anything you don't know. They say that the first draft of history is always written by journalists.
Yeah.
So essentially what I did was, because nobody's alive and things that happened in the 1700s, I went to the newspaper morgue to read those stories. And that's basically this film.
Yeah.
Is to get those stories. So.
And, it's just such an important responsibility that we have. And you talked about this earlier. My current film, More Than Our Skin, is telling the stories of people living with vitiligo, which most people have never heard of, unless you think of Michael Jackson. And then there was all this speculation as to, well, is he just trying to be white? Is he bleaching his skin? Whatever. And the reality is that he was getting treatment that most people couldn't afford or have access to at the time to treat vitiligo, which attacks the pigment in your skin. And it's an autoimmune disease, no known cure. Doctors, and I've interviewed 3 of the top renowned dermatologists who specialize in vitiligo, have no idea how people get it, how people contract it, whether it's contagious or not. There's so much not known about this, but these 5 women trusting me with telling their story is just an incredible, awesome responsibility. And that's really kind of how I feel that we are as storytellers, is that we are responsible. We're responsible for creating, as you mentioned, this historic vessel that will be there forever. And with that, as the adage says, comes great responsibility. And I wonder what one piece of advice you could give to an aspiring journalist, filmmaker, documentarian about what their responsibility needs to be if this is the field that they choose.
there is a saying, and I'm trying to say it right, that I oftentimes would end my presentations to when I would present my documentary films. And it was something to the effect, and it's an old African proverb, and that is, until the lions have their own historian, tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter.
Mm.
And that's the responsibility we have. Until the lions have their own historian, tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. And so, I'm trying to, I can. I mean, my people made great sacrifices to get me educated. And so, the one thing that I did not want to do, because I spent most of my career, working for other people, was that I always wanted to be a filmmaker. I always wanted to be a storyteller and tell the stories that I wanted to tell. And I did not, my worst nightmare was that I would die with my song still inside of me.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to die with their song still inside of them. And so if that is a motivating factor, make sure you make time. Every morning I give myself about an hour and a half to 2 hours before I start my work, after I meditate, to look at projects that I'm working on and just that time, because I think I'm freshest in the morning. And so, these are lessons that I've learned from artists that I was around while in Boston. Because Boston, for me, really became sort of a film school, or an artist school, if you will, school of the arts in that way. And I was not trained as an artist in that way, but, I've become that. So that's what I would say. Don't let your songs, die inside of you, and recognize you got a responsibility. Until the lions have their own historian, tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. And we owe ourselves our own history. We do. That's our job. So,
Clennon King, thank you so much for just this wonderful conversation. I am and continue to be such a big fan of your work, and I'm just so glad you took some time to get folks to, learn more about you and what they need to do. I appreciate it. I'm going to have links to some of your work on the website. So I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Just thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much, Tonya. This is extremely important work that you're doing, the PowerPLAY, and I really, really appreciate the work you're doing, because you're spreading our story, and one hand wash the other, hopefully. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Remember, you can listen to past episodes of the PowerPLAY Show wherever you subscribe to podcasts, including iHeartRadio, Pandora Podcasts, and now Amazon Music. You can also watch our interviews on YouTube. Simply search the Hull Bay Productions Media channel and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And as always, we air each Saturday at 5 p.m. on BroncoEyeRadio.com. So tune into the PowerPLAY Show each Thursday for a new episode wherever you subscribe to podcasts, or by watching us on our YouTube channel at Hull Bay Productions Media channel, or simply visit thepowerplayshow.com. Hi, I'm Tonya McGrath, producer and director of the upcoming film project, More Than Our Skin. I decided to make this film because I saw a need to let the stories of those living with vitiligo be heard. That it's more than the spots you see. It's the feelings, the depression, the community, and the lives of those impacted by an autoimmune disease with no known cure. More Than Our Skin plans to tell the stories of a diverse cast of people who are willing to share their journeys, many for the first time, as they make positive steps to bring understanding, inclusivity, and acceptance to this widely misunderstood disease. It is my hope that this film will change lives, not just for those with vitiligo, but for the wider audience who will understand once and for all that it's more than our skin. Thank you. If you're so inclined, please visit morethanourskin.org and learn more about the film, the incredible stories we will share, and leave a donation to help in the making of this film. Whatever you have, every donation makes a difference. And don't forget to get the tickets for our raffle at morethanourskin.com/raffle. We have some great prizes, so you don't want to miss out. Simply go to morethanourskin.org for all this information, and good luck. Until next time, I'm your host, Tonya McGrath. Be well.